It is Thursday, December 29th here in Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to our Week 17 preview podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schauf. With me, as always, is Jared Smolin. Jared, we've got a barely game on Thursday night this week. Dallas at Tennessee, Cowboys by 12. They're already heavy favorites in this one, but Tennessee already showed us how much they care about this game by basically ruling out everybody. Derrick Henry is doubtful. Everybody on defense is either doubtful or already ruled out. Anybody truly meaningful. So, I mean, it's clear that Tennessee, who doesn't need this game for anything, is treating it like the final game of the preseason, sitting anybody that matters, playing just enough players to make it an official NFL game. We're left to figure out exactly how to treat that fantasy-wise. So I guess to start with, let's start with the Dallas side, because that's the side that's actually trying to win the game. And the big injury news for them is that Tony Pollard is questionable, and according to Tom Pelissero, very much in doubt to play.
Yeah, and I don't see why Dallas would play him, right, in a game. And this game still means something to Dallas. I mean, they can still theoretically win the NFC East and still even get the 2 seed, which they might care about. But they can easily win this game without Tony Pollard. So I would plan on him not being available. That obviously helps Zeke Elliott. With Zeke, I mean, I think he's a nice RB2. I also wouldn't expect Dallas to come out here and give him 20 carries in a game where they probably aren't going to need him to carry 20 times. So I mean, I think he gets 15 or so carries, which is kind of the range he's been in most of the season, which is going to be enough because this Titans run defense has been good. It's slumped lately anyways. And again, like you said, it's going to be a bunch of backups tonight. So I think Zeke will be efficient. I think he's a good touchdown bet. I would just be surprised if he gets a massive workload in this game.
I have no idea what to expect. So all I would do is not downgrade Zeke on the expectation that he gets limited work and that they go to Malik Davis. Cause we don't know. And we've seen them plenty of times give Zeke more work than we want them to. We've seen them actually play starters when games didn't really matter. So just, I wouldn't downgrade him. What to expect is impossible to say, especially because he should pick up more receiving work with Tony Pollard out of this game too.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to say that he's going to see limited work. Just I don't think he's going to get this like massive workload. I think he's going to see enough to be a nice fantasy play. And the thing with Dallas, like I get people are worried about them pulling starters and a blowout. They have a 26.5 point implied total, third highest of the week. So like if they do pull starters, it's going to be after they put up a bunch of points. So I would not be worried about starting your Dak Prescott, your CeeDee Lamb, your Dalton Schultz, your usual Cowboy starters.
Right. They're not going to play guys for a half, score, 17 points, and then take everybody out at halftime. Because this is a game that matters for them to win. So they should score plenty of points tonight. The question also becomes, how much do they pass? I would guess that we don't get a ceiling game from Dak Prescott because I think they'd rather lean on the running game than have him drop back and throw a whole lot. Because if there's one player they certainly don't want to lose in this game, it's Dak Prescott. So you don't want to sit him back there even against backups and get him hit more often than you need to. But again, I wouldn't downgrade him for that, just not expect the ceiling. Maybe we should have seen this coming a little bit. I was doing the Underdog article yesterday morning, and Dak Prescott's Vegas numbers, like his passing yardage projection, his total yards projection, both came in well below what we were projecting for a matchup that has been pass funnel this year. And, the initial reaction is, okay, they just think Dallas is going to win this game easily. But I didn't really factor in, oh yeah, maybe Tennessee is going to sit a bunch of players and Vegas is already girding itself for that possibility. And the numbers have even come down further for Dak since then. So that's the only limitation. Again, just make sure that you don't overrate that limitation and sit Dak for somebody who's just not as good a play.
Yeah, I think you said it right. It's probably not going to be a ceiling game for these Cowboys pieces because they're not going to get pushed. But I think they're safe bets because the offense should have no trouble putting points on the board for as long as they're out there.
Yes, there's nobody that I'm sitting that I would have otherwise been playing other than Tony Pollard if he does turn up for this game active.
Agreed.
On the Titans side, like I said, Derrick Henry doubtful. It sounds like Hassan Haskins is going to be the first running back in. I don't know if we can expect him to take over all of the work. And frankly, I don't know how much it matters because this is not an offense where I'm going to be expecting significant fantasy points from anybody.
Yeah, 13.5 point implied total for the Titans. We'll see if that drops any further now that Josh, you told me Josh Dobbs was starting before the show started. I didn't even know what team Josh Dobbs was on, to be honest. So he's going to be under center tonight.
Practice squad, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, Haskins probably gets decent volume, 15 to 20 touches, I would think. But I don't think he's going to be efficient. He's not a good touchdown bet. I think, if you need an RB3 or flex play, he's an option, but he's definitely not someone I'd be looking to get into fantasy lineups tonight.
Right. If you're hard up, you can use him, but I wouldn't play him over like Deontay Foreman or even probably Zonovan Knight for the Jets.
Yeah, I definitely prefer Zonovan Knight. I think I would lean towards Foreman as well.
All right. And we'll get to more of those guys as we move beyond this game, but that's all we got for this one, right?
Yes.
Chicago at Detroit in a much more interesting fantasy spot. Lions by 6 here, over under a 52, highest over under of the week. And 8 of the past 9 Bears games have hit the over. 3 of those over the 52 points that we have projected here. 61 points, of course, between these two teams. The last time they met, the Lions have gone over in 3 of their past 4 games. 5 of their past 7 and 10 of 15 games this season. That included 60 points combined with Carolina last week. The Lions have gone over 52 points 9 times, reached it 1 other time. So this should be a spot where we get lots of points. Last week also broke a string of 7 straight wins against the spread for the Lions. Honestly, Jared, I was shocked that the Lions fell behind as much as they did to Carolina. Not shocked that Carolina could beat them, but shocked that it was a fairly one-sided game.
Carolina gained like 20 plus yards in their first like 3 or 4 runs. It was like Foreman for 30, Hubbard for 25. It was crazy. So, and the Lions run D, which we had been talking about as an improved unit, definitely did not play well in that game. The defense in general hasn't been good. You look at the last 5 weeks now, they're 30th in pass defense DVOA. They're 19th in run defense DVOA. So we're kind of back to where we started with Detroit. It seems like a shootout team. I think on the Bears side, Justin Fields, elite play, disappointed last week, but much better matchup here. He went off against the Bears first go around. I think David Montgomery is still a strong play. He out carried Khalil Herbert 16-6 in his return last week, 4 targets from Montgomery in that game too. And then I think Cole Kmet is a play this week too. Just in this game environment, the volume's been pretty good for him lately.
And certainly much better conditions this week for passing. They were outside in frigid cold with some wind in Chicago last week. This week they're inside. And, that defense you mentioned for Detroit allowed 570 yards to the Panthers last week, 250 passing, 320 rushing. So obviously that's great news for Justin Fields, David Montgomery, and Cole Kmet this week. The Chicago defense might be even worse than Detroit. It's among the worst in the league. And Jared Goff has been QB7 in fantasy scoring over the past 5 weeks. So I'm feeling pretty good about Jared Goff this week. A little bit more iffy on some other Lions pieces.
Yeah, we get Goff back at home, which is nice. Great matchup, as you mentioned, against the Bears. My only question on the Detroit side is, I think that they can beat Chicago on the ground or through the air. And lately, we've seen this be a pass-leaning offense. The Lions are 61% pass over the last 4 weeks, 7th in pass rate over expected over that span. In the first meeting against the Bears, they were 47.5% pass. They were actually negative 5% pass rate over expected. So that's the only question here. How much volume do we get from Goff? But I definitely like him because he's going to be efficient. The Lions have They have the highest implied total on the week at 29 points. Crazy to say. Goff's definitely a strong fantasy play here.
And I think Jamal Williams is another guy that I would play over Hassan Haskins just because this offense has been good and it is implied for so many points this week. And we know how much the Lions want to give Jamal Williams the ball at the goal line.
Yeah, he got banged up last week. I'm looking now, so he's not on the injury report. He hasn't scored in the last 2 games. Jamal Williams averaging just 11.8 carries over the last 3. His playing time and volume has definitely dipped as DeAndre Swift has sort of headed in the opposite direction. It's definitely a good spot for Williams. Big home favorites with the big implied total. I do think he's a good touchdown bet here. But I still think the floor, so I don't think you're going to get a ton of volume out of him this week.
I agree. I wouldn't be looking to play Jamal Williams over other guys that I'm strongly considering. I would just take 12 Jamal Williams carries over, shrug emoji carries for Hassan Haskins.
Right, that's fair.
DeAndre Swift has a nice target profile for a running back, and that's what's propping up his ranking this week. But he's sucked basically all season at delivering on his opportunities. 62.7% catch rate on a 1-yard ADOT. That's a terrible number for a running back. That's like Miles Sanders a few years ago when the Eagles stopped throwing him the ball because it wasn't working out. Tied for 12th among running backs in receptions per game, which is not a great number if that's your selling point. I'm going to play Brian Robinson. I'm going to play Tyler Algier over him. I'm probably playing Zeke Elliott. I can understand the case for DeAndre Swift over Josh Jacobs in PPR with Swift's receiving profile and Jacobs in a tough matchup that we'll get to later, but I don't think I could sit somebody that I know is getting the ball like Jacobs for somebody who's just let me down all year.
Yeah, I just think Swift's a pretty good bet for like 8 to 12 carries in this game on top of the receiving stuff. The game script obviously got away from Detroit last week, which led to just not many carries in general, and Swift only got 4 of them. But 56% of the snaps for Swift last week was his highest snap rate since week 1. Also had his highest route rate since week 8. So I still think he's trending in the right direction, like usage wise and role wise. And again, it's just an awesome matchup at home against this Bears defense with the highest implied total on the slate. So I like Swift, and PPR. I'd be happy with him as my RB2. He's definitely someone I'm going to be looking at in DFS this week as well.
I think happy is a strong word for it, but I can understand the path for Swift to be that RB2. DJ Chark has moved up our rankings this morning. He certainly is somebody with a low floor in case he doesn't get the targets, but they have been throwing him the ball a decent amount lately since he came back from injury. He has 5 full games since returning from that injury. They kept him out a while. He had just 2 catches against the Bills, but then 5 for 98, 6 for 94 and a touchdown, 1 against the Jets, but then 4 for 108 last week against the Panthers. So what we've seen in his 5 games is 2 weak outings versus the tougher defenses that he faced, and 3 really productive games against the not top defenses. And this is certainly a not top defense this week.
Yeah, for sure. The matchup and just the game environment is what's working in Chark's favor. Again, the volume has not been great, just 5 targets per game over those last 5. He's been running super hot efficiency wise. He has a 72% catch rate over the last 5 games with 18.6 yards per catch. And this is a guy throughout his career has been like in the mid 50s as far as catch rate goes, which is because he plays that downfield role. So that's the scary part with Chark. You're not getting great volume, and if he doesn't catch 72% of those, it's probably going to be a disappointing game. But the matchup, I think, puts him in play. I'd consider him a boom or bust wide receiver 3
for sure. And I mean, if you like looking at him, certainly it's a scary profile. And if we were mid-season, we'd be talking about DJ Chark as a sell right now. But since we're deciding for 1 week to try to win the championship, his quarterback's been running hot. The offense is scoring. Vegas expects lots of points from him. The matchup is terrific. So for this 1 week, I'm going to take a shot on him. I'm going to chase that ceiling and not worry about the floor, especially when you look at the other running backs. Look at the other wide receivers around him in the rankings. It's like all of these guys, you could say, yeah, but his floor is not great. His floor is not great. His floor is not great.
Yeah, and I don't think it's wrong to consider your matchup too in making a decision like this. If you think you're an underdog, play someone like Chark who has the higher ceiling. But if you think you're a significant favorite, I might sit him in favor of someone who I can count on 7 to 8 targets for and 4 to 5 catches just to get me 10 PPR points.
Yeah, just my caution on that would be don't overrate the certainty of targets for other guys. But we'll get to more specific players as we move through the other games. Anybody else from this one like Shane Zylstra?
No, do not play Shane Zylstra.
Carolina at Tampa Bay, Bucks by 3. Jared, my first question, the over-under, by the way, 39.5, so not expecting huge numbers from this one. But my first question for fantasy decisions is, what do we do with the Panthers running backs? My personal answer is I have no idea.
Yeah. Me either. I think Deontay Foreman's been a tough guy to rank really, since the Christian McCaffrey trade. He's had some massive games. He's generally been pretty efficient, but the problem is, first of all, he does nothing in the passing game. He has 1 target over his last 4 games. And then this has turned into like a 60-40 backfield split. Over the last 4 games, Deontay Foreman has 58% of the running back carries to 36 for Chuba Hubbard. Then you have, Raheem Blackshear mixing in a little bit as well. So, the Panthers running game had a big one against the Bucks, and that, then it seemed like a super surprising Panthers win, about a month or 2 ago over Tampa, but it doesn't seem as surprising now. But both these guys had nice games there. They had positive game script working in their favor, which allowed them to carry 24 total times. That's the risk. If Tampa jumps out to a lead here, that Foreman and Hubbard could be duds.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think rather than look for somebody's recommendation on this one, you're going to have to decide, because it could be awesome or it could be terrible. And a lot of that is going to depend on game flow here, because there have been wide variations ever since Deontay Foreman and Chuba Hubbard emerged here. We've had 8 games now. Deontay Foreman has 5 with 20 or more carries in that range. He's been over 100 yards in 4 of those, went for 74 in that other one against Seattle. And he didn't score in that game, but both other Panthers backs did. So that obviously was a good spot overall for Panthers runners. But those were all in wins except for the week 8 OT loss to Atlanta that should have been a win if DJ Moore hadn't taken his helmet off. He had 11 carries or fewer in the other 3 games in that 8-game span. All losses. So if they get ahead of Tampa Bay here, and of course they did beat Tampa Bay previously, or that first big game for both running backs. So if they get ahead and Tampa Bay has not been playing well, we could certainly get lots more work for Foreman. If they fall behind early, we could get 10 carries and you're going to feel like an idiot for playing Foreman over anybody else. So you're really going to have to weigh him against your specific other options and make a decision.
And I don't think Tampa is good enough to jump out to a big lead here. It's like I do think Foreman probably gets 15 carries, with the upside for 20. For me, it's just the lack of passing game usage really hurts him in PPR. Like he's a much better play, even in half PPR and definitely in non-PPR. But for me in PPR, like he's just an RB3 or flex play.
Yeah, I think it's easier to make the upside case if you're comparing him with like Isaiah Pacheco or J.K. Dobbins, guys that have similar concerns where you're just guessing at who has the best ceiling this week. But yeah, if you're comparing him with somebody who has the receiving upside, it's tough to play. It's tough to play Deontay Foreman over DeAndre Swift, even though I don't like DeAndre Swift.
Yeah, I think Foreman and Dobbins, that's a good comp for this week. Even Pacheco has some passing game role that would make me lean towards him pretty easily over Deontay Foreman.
Bucks are 2-3 since their bye. They've reached 20 points once in that span. They needed overtime on Sunday night to beat Trace McSorley. They beat the Saints by 1 point in that span. They lost to the Browns. They got pounded by the Niners and Bengals. So like Jared was saying, I don't think this team's good enough to jump out to a big lead on anybody right now either. They've also turned the ball over 11 times in the past 4 games versus just 5 takeaways. So they've been sloppy. If that happens, that could certainly swing game flow in the favor of the Panthers and their running backs. Sam Darnold, his yardage prop has climbed since yesterday when I was doing that underdog article, which, by the way, is free on draftsharks.com right now. So you can go see some highlighted plays. He hasn't thrown more than 24 passes in a game yet this year. I would bet on him hitting a season high in that particular category. I don't think it matters for Sam Darnold for fantasy, but I think it's an upside spot for DJ Moore.
Yeah, this is the 5th run heaviest offense over the last 4 weeks in terms of pass rate over expected. Yeah, it's definitely how the Panthers want to win. Now, Moore has a 26+% target share in 3 of Sam Darnold's 4 starts. So, Darnold is looking his way, and that's what's kept Moore's fantasy value afloat. But beyond the fact that he's just good and he's actually been efficient so far with Sam Darnold. So, yeah, Moore's another guy where the floor is kind of low because you could get a 5 target game if Carolina only has to throw it, 20 times. But I'm with you. I do think we probably get a bit more passing volume here with the Panthers underdogs.
And it helps that we are betting on a good player who has been getting really good target share since Sam Darnold took over.
Yep.
On the Bucs side, it's hard to ignore the names when you're deciding between Tom Brady, Mike Evans, and other guys at those positions, but we really have to look at how they've been faring. Mike Evans, 9 for 96 on 15 targets in the first meeting with Carolina a while ago, 6 for 123 the next game against Baltimore. But then from week 9 on, he's averaging 8 targets, 4 catches, and 48.6 yards per game. He has a 50% catch rate in that span, 6.1 yards per target, 20th in expected PPR points per game among wideouts in that time, 60th in actual PPR points per game.
Yeah, I've been chasing Mike Evans in DFS for like a month now. I don't have a ton of him in season long, but I've definitely been chasing him in DFS. I might do it again, honestly. Like you said, the usage has been okay. He had a nice game against Carolina earlier this season. J.C. Horn is out for this game. Would have been one of Evans' primary matchups on the outside. Definitely not a must start, Mike Evans, but still sits inside like low end wide receiver 2 territory in our ranks. He's a guy I'd be okay with starting just because, like you said, the usage has still been pretty good for him.
Yeah, like when I look at the wide receiver rankings, I want to move Mike Evans down, and then you look at the guys behind him, and it's like, all right, I guess I can't really move him down. The mark in his favor, no J.C. Horn for the Panthers. Their top corner's out. He broke a wrist last week, had surgery. Definitely out for this game. We'll see beyond that. So that's a mark in his favor. Leonard Fournette, fairly easy play after clearly leading the backfield in week 16. 20 more snaps than Rachaad White, 13 more carries, 6 more targets.
Yeah, Fournette is 6th among running backs in expected fantasy points over the last 2 weeks. So, that fact alone kind of makes him tough to bench. It is a tough matchup. Carolina 3rd in Football Outsiders run defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks, and Carolina held Rachaad White and Leonard Fournette to just 43 rushing yards on 3.1 yards per carry earlier this season. So I still don't expect an efficient rushing day for the Bucs running backs, but Fournette probably gets his 10 to 15 carries, and just the passing game usage for Fournette especially has just continued to be there.
And I think it's tough to use White unless you really need to. He's not a target player for me.
Yeah. Yep. Agreed.
Anything else from that game?
Nope.
We did, by the way, the NFL guys are now saying that Tony Pollard is expected to be inactive tonight, so we won't have to make a decision on him. Mike Garafolo says breakout week coming for Malik Davis. Now, the way he's talking about it, it sounds more like somebody that's hearing from the team that they really like him and creating his own path for Malik Davis, as opposed to somebody in his ear saying Malik Davis is getting the ball a lot tonight, because he did not specifically tweet that out from what I can see.
Yeah, that's just what I'm saying with Zeke. Like, I don't think they're going to load him up for 20 plus carries. I think Zeke's probably going to get his 15 or so carries. He'll be fine. He's a nice fantasy play. Then I think Davis is just going to get whatever's kind of left over.
Showdowns tonight. That's where Malik Davis can be a strong option, though.
For sure.
On to Denver at Kansas City. Chiefs by 13.5, over under 45. This one, of course, the last meeting, the Chiefs jumped out to a 27-0 lead. We all thought the game was over. The Broncos stormed back with 4 passing touchdowns, 3 of those to Jerry Jeudy, the last after Russell Wilson had suffered a concussion. This time, though, Broncos are implied for just 15.75 points. So I'm going to go ahead and bet against the Denver offense as opposed to betting on anything that we saw in that first meeting.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch the game against the Rams on Christmas, it's tough to feel good about anything in this Broncos. I mean, Jerry Jeudy continues to get it done. Now, Jeudy, it sounds like he left practice early on Wednesday with what's on the injury report is an ankle, and he had he's had ankle issues in the past, so that's worth keeping an eye on. Jeudy was the only guy I felt good about in this offense. If he's out, I do think Courtland Sutton becomes interesting just as a pure target play. We did see Sutton get 7 targets, a 20% target share in his return from a hamstring injury last week. His playing time, he was full go in terms of playing time. So we'll see where the Jeudy thing goes. And I would think Sutton would climb my rankings 5 to 10 spots if Jeudy ends up sitting.
Yeah, I could see that. And we'll see about the injury. Like you said, I let my family turn on a movie instead of watching that Rams Broncos game on Christmas, to be honest.
Good. Smart.
Elsewhere in this offense, I think the only other guys that you would consider are Jeudy if he's ready. And obviously we'll have to watch that. Greg Dulcich, who didn't practice at all Wednesday because of a hamstring injury. So if he continues to trend in that direction, he'll be easy to sit. I would love to not play anything from this, already quit on everything team.
Yeah, Dulcich left late in that Rams game with the hamstring, so I'm not expecting him to play. I mean, the other guy to consider here is Latavius Murray, who I do think – so Chase Edmonds ended up playing a lot last week. I went back and looked, and almost all of his touches came in garbage time, and Denver was already down multiple scores. So I do still think Murray is the clear lead back here and in play as an RB3 if you need him.
And this is absolute garbage time completely for Denver. Some teams you would say, oh, the coach is out. Maybe the team rebounds here. But all of the reports out of Denver are not the players hate Nathaniel Hackett. It's the players hate Russell Wilson. So he's still there. I don't have a reason to believe that Denver's going to mentally rebound this week.
Agreed.
On the Chiefs side, I mean, the plays are obvious. I think the one thing to warn against is overrating your concern for Juju Smith-Schuster last week because he had the 3 catches for 27. There was no change in his role. We had only 51 total plays from the Chiefs. We had just 16 of 28 for 224 yards passing for Mahomes in that one. Last time these two teams met, we had 9 for 74 and a touchdown for Juju. So I'm still playing him fairly comfortably.
Yeah, something I probably even underrated last week. So, I was on Juju Smith-Schuster as a cash game play. It's just Seattle's defense has been tough against wide receivers all season. So that was just not an easy matchup for Juju. I still feel good about him. It does look like McCole Hardman's going to make his return this week. They're just worth keeping an eye on his role. Maybe as we get ahead looking towards these playoff contests. But I would not trust him in his first game back. And I still think Juju is a pretty solid target bet.
Yeah, I don't think McCole Hardman's taking snaps away from Juju, and we'll have to watch his status. We'll have to watch reports on him because we're not going to get status updates via practice reports because he's not on the active roster yet.
Correct.
Anything else from that game?
No, I think status quo in the backfield where, Pacheco is going to be the lead ball carrier. McKinnon's still playing a valuable role in the passing game. And also, he scored another touchdown last week. He continues to be the guy they're looking to in the red zone.
Agreed. So actually, we've got a specific question to this backfield from Scott McCaffrey on YouTube. He's a 24-point favorite in the finals in a 10-team PPR league. He's got McKinnon, he's got Tyler Algier, he's got Leonard Fournette, wondering whether to play Algier or Fournette for a higher floor versus Jerick McKinnon, since the upside might not be as important in this matchup.
So it sounds like he needs two of them. I mean, Fournette to me is the first guy in, just with the safest role. I still lean McKinnon over Algier in full PPR. I mean, I like Algier this week, but I mean, there's a chance he gets 15 carries for 80 yards, doesn't score a touchdown, and that's 8 points. I think McKinnon can beat that just on his passing game role alone.
Well, Algier also clearly led the backfield in receiving last week. I know it's one week and it could easily change again this week. So I really like the upside on Algier this week. It's tough to say what will happen this week because we don't have a long record of what to expect. All we have is the past 2 weeks. He's been ahead. So my guess is that continues this week, because why go back to Cordarrelle Patterson this week after 2 straight of Tyler Algier playing well? But it's just a guess. And Jerick McKinnon has been pretty good to you PPR wise in recent weeks, and it hasn't been with the Chiefs playing from behind. So, I mean, I honestly, I'm not sure what I would do at the moment in my own lineup for PPR.
You're in good shape either way, I think, Scott. All 3 of those guys are top 16 running backs in their rankings. I don't think any of them are going to really let you down.
Yeah, I agree. There is no definitely this guy is out for me among those. It certainly helps McKinnon that he is Patrick Mahomes running back.
Exactly.
Indy at the Giants next game here. Giants by 5.5, over under of 38.5. And I believe in that low over under for this game. For the Indy offense, I don't think Nick Foles can be as bad as he was Monday night against the Chargers. He graded out worse in that game than Malik Willis has lately, than Desmond Ridder has. If he does play that bad again, I've got to think that they yank him before this game is over. Yeah. Still, the way that he played certainly hurts the outlook for Michael Pittman.
Yeah, why did the Colts lean pass in that game? I mean, they'd been run heavy under Jeff Saturday. That's a run funnel matchup against the Chargers, and they were +3 pass rate over expected last week. So that was surprising to see. That hurt Zach Moss, who he didn't do much for you if you used him last week, but he got 12 of 13 running back carries after dominating backfield work the previous week after Jonathan Taylor left. Moss played 69% of the offensive snaps. He only got 1 target last week, but he also led the backfield in pass routes at 46%. And this Giants run defense, we talked about it last week, it just has not been good for a while now. So, Zach Moss is another guy kind of in that RB3 mix. I would use Zach Moss over Hassan Haskins.
Yes, I would do that as well. It seems like Jeff Saturday runs this offense, and I'm assuming that he's running or at least piloting the offense. It seems like he runs it like a guy who kind of is an NFL fan, like thinks that he knows a lot about football, but doesn't really know as much as he thinks. And he's telling himself all week, we've got to push the ball downfield. We've got to make deep passes. So he goes in the game like, we're going to establish this in the game. I don't care what's happening. And then despite Nick Foles going out there and his arm saying, oh, it's not going to happen, guys, he still sticks with it, trying to make it happen, even though the game was close into the second half. It's frustrating to watch, even without having any horses in the race. Like, I don't have anything to root for on that side, but it's just frustrating to watch a team clearly trying to do something that it can't do instead of just going with the thing that has been working and against the thing that defense is weak against. Zach Moss, I agree. There's upside this week. I would love to say he's a real option, but we don't know after the way he was used on Monday night. Over 5 yards per carry in that game against the Chargers. This is a positive matchup against the Giants. So if he does get used, there's upside to him, but we'll have to see if the coaches say anything about that changing.
Yeah, hopefully you can do better than Zach Moss, but again, I do think he's going to get 15 plus touches in this game, so he's an option. And then Michael Pittman, wide receiver 3, boring wide receiver 3 played. I mean, he did see a 24% target share last week from Nick Foles. He's kind of been around that mark, regardless of who's been under center for Indy. So, he's an okay Valiant bet, just tough to get excited about any sort of upside with Michael Pittman.
Yeah, near silent 24% target share. I'm not even sure all those targets actually were near him.
Probably
The
not.
only other guy I think worth mentioning, there's no practice for Kylan Granson still on Wednesday, who missed that game. I think if he continues to sit, it makes Jelani Woods mildly interesting. Obviously, if there was any good quarterback play, we could call him for real interesting. But,
Yep.
if you're scraping for a tight end, there's some upside here.
Yeah, desperation play, someone to consider in DFS. But the Giants have been bad against tight ends this season. We just saw TJ Hawkinson have a massive game against them. So yeah, Woods is in play. Hopefully, you can do better.
On the Giants side, the Colts defense is coming off 2 straight positive performances against the Vikings and the Chargers. It's kind of easy to overlook that the defense actually played well for nearly all of that game against the Vikings because of the Minnesota comeback, but they tied the Eagles for 8th best defensive DVOA that week that they lost that game to Minnesota. Not a high upside spot for anybody on the Giants offense, I don't think. I would not be surprised if this game goes under the total. We've had 4 of the past 6 Giants games go over, but a lot of that has been the opponents. Lions, Cowboys, Eagles, Vikings all score plenty of points, and I don't think that the Colts are capable of doing that.
Yeah, this definitely feels like a 20-10 game. So yeah, Daniel Jones, he was quarterback 10 last week, and as you said, turned into a shootout against Minnesota. He has been a top 11 fantasy quarterback in 4 of his last 6 games now. So yeah, that makes him an option. I think I'd rather play Gardner Minshew among guys that might be available on your waiver wire. But Jones does check in at the bottom of the top 12 in our rankings this week.
Yes, I would chase upside in a guy like Gardner Minshew over Daniel Jones, but I like Daniel Jones better than Aaron Rodgers, and I would feel okay if Daniel Jones is my quarterback this week.
Yep, agreed.
Anything else from that game?
We should talk about the wide receivers, I guess. The target distribution between Slayton, Hodgins, and James, it's been pretty equal over the last 4 games now. It's actually Richie James leading with 29 targets, Isaiah Hodgins 27, Darius Slayton 24. So they're all wide receiver 4 plays. Again, it just doesn't feel like a game where they're going to need to do a whole lot of passing.
Yeah, and if you're asking who's going to be the guy among them, no idea, because it's not like this guy is leading the way. The thing that Darius Slayton has over the other 2 is that his work comes downfield, so he needs less to go right for him to produce. He just needs to make the catch, and he's going to outscore these guys. Obviously, the fact that he goes further downfield makes him a flimsier bet to make those catches. So it all kind of balances out to where if you need a Giants receiver, any of them could be fine. None of them is exciting.
Yeah, Slayton's been getting the downfield work. Hodgins has been getting a lot of the red zone work, though, so that's kind of what's working in his favor.
Mm-hmm. Jacksonville at Houston, Jaguars by 4.5, over under a 43.5. Houston has been a negative scoring matchup for passing games. I think everybody's pretty much aware of that at this point. 2nd worst for QB scoring by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. 4th worst for wide receiver scoring, neutral for a tight end. So maybe we get another Evan Engram week. But Jared, is this a matchup that we actually adjust things down for Jaguars passing game pieces?
No, I'm not adjusting down at this point with Houston. I'm not adjusting up. I'm just sort of treating it as a neutral matchup. The reason Houston was a bad matchup for most of the season is just because teams were running against them so much. They're actually 4th in pass defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks now. They have been playing better. I'm just not betting against Trevor Lawrence at this point, though. We just saw him deliver against the Jets in bad weather, against a tough defense. Now he had the rushing touchdown, which is what sort of got him there. But that's part of his game too. He's been giving you 20 to 30 rushing yards per game. So I'd feel good if Trevor Lawrence was my starter this week.
Yes, I agree. I don't think it's a matchup to downgrade good passing game pieces. And if you look at the single game DVOA ratings from Football Outsiders for the Houston defense, you see wide swings in their performance by matchups here. A big part of them being tough on the pass is that it's so easy to run against them and that it's so easy to beat them. They've faced the most rushing attempts in the league. They're 30th in scoring. They're last in offensive yards. So you get way ahead. You just run. There's really no reason to force passing on them most of the time. So like I said, no downgrade for Trevor Lawrence. I'm not downgrading Christian Kirk or Zay Jones here either. Big upgrade for sure for Travis Etienne. And really, I just have my fingers crossed, Jared, that we get a huge Jaguars offensive game, because I got lots of these guys at play for some big money this weekend.
Yeah, good matchup to have. A lot of Jags. I think they'll put up points in this game. Etienne and Ingram are, I think, both elite plays at their positions. I mean, the volume Ingram's been getting 40 targets over his last 4 games. The one thing I'll say about Christian Kirk, Houston has been the 3rd toughest matchup for slot receivers this season. They held Kirk to just 1 catch on 3 targets in their first meeting. Now, Kirk still plays like a third of his snaps on the outside. I think he'll be fine. Maybe that's a reason to push targets towards Zay Jones, towards Evan Ingram in this matchup.
And for what it's worth, this offense doesn't need Christian Kirk to be a leader. So there are other offenses where you'll say, yeah, they're going to find spots to get him the ball. We've seen from Jacksonville, they're okay if Christian Kirk gets shut down. They can just go to Evan Ingram. They can go to Travis Etienne on the ground. They can go to Zay Jones, and they'll be all right in this matchup. And, you mentioned the first meeting, and that might give people some pause. The Jags only scored 6 points in that one. They lost that game at home to Houston, but they also had 422 yards of offense, their largest total to that point. Since then, they've had 3 more games of more than 420 yards. Lawrence is playing much better now than he was at that point. He's got 3 games of more than 290 passing in 5 games since their bye. No practice for him Wednesday, but it's just managing the toe injury at this point. I don't think there's any reason to worry about him playing in this game. And the other lingering question that we haven't addressed yet is, we already saw Tennessee say, we don't need this week, we're going to rest a whole bunch of people. Jacksonville's in the same spot where they don't need this game. Everything for them rides on whether they beat Tennessee next week. But Doug Peterson, direct quote, said this week, there is never a meaningless game. Never, ever, ever, ever. We play to win every game, and the only way I rest players is if they're hurt and can't go. So we've seen coaches say things and not totally mean them before. I can't say 100% that means everybody plays the game healthy, but all I can do right now is trust that Doug Peterson means that and expect that everybody plays here unless they get an enormous lead. And, if we get to that point, then our guys have probably already paid off.
Yeah, the other thing with Jacksonville, which I do think matters, they have like a 6% chance, I think it is, to get a wild card spot, even if they don't end up winning the AFC South. Whereas, Tennessee, it's either AFC South title or they're out. So, this game is not totally meaningless for Jacksonville. It's 6%, but I'm not resting guys even for a 6% chance.
Yeah, give us the points, Dougie. We need them this week. Arizona at Atlanta, Falcons by 3.5, over under 42. The game total says don't overrate the offensive upside of this one, and I certainly agree with that. But it's a great spot for some key players for our fantasy lineups. We'll start with James Conner, who's tops among Cardinals, I think, is a fantasy option here. You got to smile if you have him in your lineup this week. And Jared, it might be a week to smile about DeAndre Hopkins as well.
Yeah, Arizona gets Colt McCoy back, and he's a legitimate NFL starter, whereas or NFL quarterback. He can move the ball, he can complete passes. Trace McSorley can. I mean, Colt McCoy has a 71% completion rate with the Cardinals over the last 2 seasons, and especially for DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, Hopkins averaged 12.3 targets in Colt McCoy's 3 games this season. Now, 2 of those came without Hollywood Brown, so I don't expect that level of volume, but I do think Hopkins is going to get targeted. Which he did last week, by the way. What do you have, like 9 targets? Caught 1 of them. He'll be much more efficient with Colt McCoy. I think in this matchup, especially, Hopkins is a pretty easy fantasy starter this week.
Yeah, his other 2 games with Colt McCoy this year, since Kyler Murray went down, which is with Marquis Brown back, he's had 11 targets, 7 catches in each of them. So, like DeAndre Hopkins this week, I can't say that I really like Marquis Brown. There's always the talent upside for him, and his targets have been okay, but I don't know that they're going to have a whole lot of passing volume overall in this game, unless Atlanta somehow manages to get out to a lead. And Greg Dortch got a lot last week, and I would say let's throw that one out because it was one Trace McSorley game, and they were trying to protect him. But we've seen Arizona load up their slot receivers all season. So, maybe we don't get that many targets from Marquise Brown here.
Yeah, and Brown's playing time was down last week, 72% of the routes, and he had the groin injury. He also said Cliff Kingsbury was disciplining him after he was late to a team meeting. So I don't love Hollywood Brown. I think he's a wide receiver 3. I mean, he had 8 targets in that one game with Colt McCoy this season. I think that's a reasonable expectation, but I would definitely not trust Greg Dortch. He had I think he had 1 total target in his 2 games prior to last week. I think he played more because of the Marquise Brown situation, and I wouldn't be surprised if Arizona goes back to playing that AJ Green, Robbie Anderson combo on the outside and using, Marquis Brown more in the slot this week.
Yeah, AJ Green was out Wednesday with an illness, so we'll see if that affects his status for Sunday. But I also would not be surprised if we get not any Greg Dortch in this game. I'm certainly not playing Greg Dortch. I think I would probably play DJ Chark over Marquise Brown chasing the upside, though.
Yeah, that's reasonable. Again, that's where I might look to, my matchup. I do think Brown's a better target bet. I definitely think Chark has more upside, though.
Mm-hmm. On the Falcons side, Tyler Algier, Drake London both look pretty good this week. Algier ahead of Cordero Patterson in playing time, carries, and pass routes last week. 2 straight strong yardage games for him. And the one last week came against Baltimore. So that makes me especially confident, might be a strong word, but I feel good about Tyler Algier versus the other things we have to go with at running back.
Yeah, this is just a major mismatch. I mean, Atlanta's running game's been good all season. They're third in rush offense DVOA over the last 5 weeks. Arizona 28th in rush defense DVOA. So it's a great spot for Atlanta's running game. It does look like Algier's kind of emerged as the clear leader here. It's still a committee. Patterson's still involved, but Algier season highs in back-to-back weeks with 17 and then 18 carries. As you said, he had the 5 targets last week. He's playing really well. He's averaging 5.8 yards per carry over his last 5 games, and he's 5th among 57 qualifiers in PFF rushing grade over that span. Algier also has 4 carries inside the 5-yard line over the past 2 weeks for just 1 for Patterson. So he's kind of been the clear goal line guy lately. So, everything lines up in his favor. I still don't think you're going to get a ton of work in the passing game just because Atlanta's not throwing a whole lot. But I think that the rushing ceiling here is high for Algier.
Yeah, I agree. And for, the team that we said is going to run the ball a lot, 17 and 18 carries for Algier the past 2 weeks with Patterson, plenty involved as well. Cardinals are the 5th best scoring matchup for running backs by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. So great spot. We expect the work. I like Tyler Algier this week. And Drake London, 3 straight games of 9+ targets, 6+ receptions, and 70+ yards. 2 of those games with Desmond Ridder, and over that 3-game span, London has seen 38.6% target share. So he's one of those floor PPR plays in wide receiver 3 range. If you're, looking at guys like Marquise Brown, DJ Chark, and feeling iffy, I think.
Yeah, Desmond Ridder was a little better last week against a pretty solid Baltimore defense. He completed 67% of his passes, still just 6.6 yards per attempt. He was 25th in PFF passing grade on the week. So again, better, still not great. You need London to keep getting like 30% of Atlanta's targets to be a solid fantasy play. I feel pretty good betting on that being the case, so just because there's no one else to throw to.
Yeah, if we had good quarterback play or good passing volume here, I think Drake London would be like wide receiver 20 with what he's doing lately. But given what we do have, I think that's what makes him a floor, mid to low wide receiver 3.
He's 8th among receivers in expected fantasy points over the past 2 weeks, just showing you the level of volume he's getting.
Mm-hmm. Anything else from that game?
Nope.
Miami at New England, Patriots by 2.5, over under 41.5. Teddy Bridgewater is going to be the quarterback for the Dolphins after the 3rd concussion of the season for Tua Tagovailoa. We'll see about him for week 18, but that won't matter for most fantasy folks. I think Bridgewater's probably not a downgrade, and it's possible that he's an upgrade from what we've gotten lately from Tua. Past 3 weeks have delivered 3 of Tua's 4 worst PFF grades of the season. His other came back in week 1 against the Patriots. He's 29th in PFF passing grade over the past 3 weeks among 31 quarterbacks with at least 50 dropbacks. He's been worse than Zach Wilson, worse than Russell Wilson, worse than Derek Carr, worse than Colt McCoy in that category. So we're going from a quarterback that's been playing poorly to a quarterback that has at least been okay in some relief duty this year.
Yeah, Bridgewater is a viable NFL quarterback. He's averaged 8.7 yards per attempt in that brief duty with the Dolphins this season. I mean, you're just trusting the scheme and the weapons. I'm not really downgrading Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle for the quarterback change.
Yeah, and it's been a neutral scoring matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. 2nd worst scoring matchup for running backs by the same measure. So, I mean, that only further helps, I think, the upside for the Dolphins passing game.
For sure, yeah. And the backfield's tough to figure out. I mean, it's just been going back and forth who leads. It's going to be a committee. We know, Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert are going to be involved. Would you play Hassan Haskins over these Dolphins running backs?
Oh, God.
I mean, I think that's the range that you should be considering Miami running backs at this point, though, considering the usage in this matchup.
I honestly think I would probably play a Miami running back just because I believe in that offense more than I believe in tonight's Tennessee offense. And
Yeah.
again, I have no idea how much Haskins is going to carry the ball. We're all assuming he's going to be the lead back, but I
Yeah.
mean, if he carries 15 times to 12 for Julius Chestnut, then we're going to be like, what the hell was that?
Yeah, I might lean the same direction. Because both these backs can rip off a long play. I think they're both better touchdown bets than Hassan Haskins is. So I might lean in the Dolphins running back direction too.
If that's the decision you're making, though, just know that we are all completely guessing on this.
Yeah, and congrats for making it to your title game with that type of decision.
You're right. Patriots side, Jacoby Myers is fine. The targets have been there. He was lucky to score for fantasy owners last week, though. 48-yard touchdown catch off of a teammate's hands.
Yeah, fine, I think is the word. I mean, I still don't want to trust anything in this Patriots passing game. They had a good second half. It was just a weird game. Total domination by the Bengals in the first half. The Bengals kind of laid down and let the Patriots back in it. But yeah, I mean, Myers is okay. He's the best target bet. He did get back to 100% of the routes last week after being limited off the concussion back in week 15. So that makes him a bit easier to trust. And then otherwise, Ramondre Stevenson let you down. If you survive, though, I definitely stick with him. He played 91% of the snaps last week, ran her out on 75% of the pass play. So he's still getting, like James Conner level playing time. So to me, he's still an easy starter.
And Damian Harris was not back for that game, though, right?
He wasn't. He was limited again in Wednesday's practice, which he's been for a few weeks now. So we'll see if he makes it back for this one. Big game, obviously. That would knock Stevenson down, a few spots in the rankings, but to me, he'd still be like a high-end RB2, even if Harris returns for this one.
Yeah, I can see that. Nothing else from that game, right?
Nope.
Cleveland at Washington Commanders by 2 over under 40.5. Nick Chubb, first player to worry about on the Cleveland side, the third worst scoring matchup for running backs by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry have been the only two running backs to reach 80 rushing yards against Washington this season. Barkley did so in just one of his two meetings with the team. Derrick Henry averaged 3.6 yards per carry in his 102-yard game against Washington. So it's been a bad matchup for running backs. The Washington rushing DVOA is down the past 2 weeks, so I think that makes it not a must-bench spot for Nick Chubb, but he's certainly in low RB2 territory.
Yeah, I think that's fair just because this offense is struggling. Chubb has not been his usual efficient self. I wonder if that foot issue that's been on the injury report for the past couple weeks has something to do with that. I mean, he's only averaging 4 yards per carry over his last 4 games. This is a guy who consistently is 5+ yards per carry. He is still averaging 19 carries over the last 4, and this game should stay close enough where I do think you're going to get enough volume for Chubb where he's not going to kill you. But this definitely doesn't look like an upside spot for him.
Yeah, I would play Tyler Algier easily ahead of him. I'd play Brian Robinson over him. I would play Josh Jacobs also in a negative matchup because Josh Jacobs at least gets receiving as well.
Yeah, Robinson for sure. Algier probably. We'll get to Jacobs. I'm waiting if we get any reports on Sunday that they're going to scale back Jacobs' workload at this point because there's no reason for them to be giving him 25 touches a game, but we'll see. Again, haven't heard anything to say that's going to be the case.
I mean, there's also no reason to save him because he has no contract for next year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there's a chance they end up bringing him back though.
Yeah, but you're not saving him for the free agent market. I mean, if anything, you wear him down further and then you sign him for less money.
Cruel. You're so cruel.
I mean, it's a business. So if they liked him that much, they would have gone ahead and extended for that year so that they didn't let him hit the open market. But, we'll watch and see what's said. Maybe there's some let's see if Zamir White is any good at football. But certainly the usage so far doesn't say that they're excited about him at all. And there's nobody else in the backfield that's like a maybe for the future guy. So I'm not currently concerned at all about Josh Jacobs's outlook for touches. Put to the Browns, wide receivers, David Njoku, both look fine at their levels, I think. Yep. It's not an exciting spot, though, because Deshaun Watson has yet to do anything good.
Correct. Yeah, it's a tough matchup for Njoku, too. Washington 10th in adjusted points allowed to tight ends, 3rd in Football Outsiders tight end coverage rankings. But 20 targets for Njoku over the last 3 games with Deshaun Watson. I think he's good enough to beat any matchup. So he's still a pretty solid tight end 1, I think, this week.
Mm-hmm. On the Washington side, Antonio Gibson had no practice Wednesday, listed with foot and knee issues. He's been listed with the foot since week 13, but that was the last week that he actually missed a practice. So we'll watch this one and see about his status. Either way, I think it's a great spot for Brian Robinson this week.
For sure, for sure. 18 plus carries in 3 of his last 4 games for Brian Robinson. Cleveland continues to struggle against the run. They're 30th in adjusted points allowed to running backs, and Washington's favored in this game. It should be a spot where they can get Brian Robinson 18 to 22 carries.
Yeah, he is one of my favorite plays on Underdog right now. Again, check the free Underdog article on draftsharks.com. You can see 17 highlighted plays for this week. You can certainly keep checking back because they'll keep adding more to the pick'em bin on Underdog. You can check with our rankings to see who stands out as the best over or under bets. But Brian Robinson's still at 64.5 yards for rushing. And that's right where he was last week against the Niners, where we had him as an under because it was a terrible matchup. This is a terrific matchup. And even last week, he got 22 carries in a game where the rushing was not working. So they want to give Brian Robinson the ball. I know that when Carson Wentz was starting at the beginning of the season, they were much more of a pass leaning team. They didn't have Brian Robinson for that stretch. He came back right at the end of when Carson Wentz was starting and still didn't really get up to full speed like he has been the past few games till after Carson Wentz hit IR. So I would expect that this team is going to stay similar on offense and only up the passing volume if they somehow fall behind this Cleveland team.
Yeah, I expect the same, especially in this matchup. Cleveland's actually second in Football Outsiders pass defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks, 26th against the run. So it definitely looks like a run funnel matchup. And I do think that's how Washington's going to want to play, even with Wentz back under center.
Terry McLaurin, the QB switch, is definitely not good. I mean, we'll see if that changes, but he had 16% target share with Carson Wentz around early in the season. And we were talking every week about how it was just being spread evenly among the top 3 wideouts.
Yeah, McLaurin was 50th among receivers in expected fantasy points per game with Carson Wentz. He was 16th with Taylor Heineke. I mean, it was what, a six game sample with Wentz. Like, I don't want to get too crazy on it. Even last week, though, Wentz comes in, he only targets McLaurin on 1 of his 16 passes. So, I mean, I think you definitely have to downgrade McLaurin for the quarterback change. I don't think it takes him out of fantasy consideration, but I definitely think it's bad news.
Yeah, I don't say sit Terry McLaurin, but if everything were the same as it has been since Taylor Heineke took over, he'd be sitting probably 15th or so in our rankings. Yeah. As it is, he's 25th, I believe, in the PPR ranks.
Yep, agreed.
What else do we have from that game? I just clicked over to our rankings.
Dotson?
So I guess we talk about Jaydon Dotson and maybe Curtis Samuel. Dotson is the one who's been coming up to McLaurin in targets over the past couple games, even before the switch back to Carson Wentz.
Yeah, Dotson leads Washington in targets over the last 3 games with 24 of them, 23% target share. Now, he was productive with Carson Wentz over the first 4 games. It was kind of fluky, though. He had 4 touchdowns in those 4 games. He only averaged 5.5 targets per game on a 13% target share. But I think later in the season now for a rookie, he's more entrenched in the offense. I do think Dotson is in play. And I don't think the quarterback change can be bad news for him, just considering, Wentz probably isn't going to target Terry McLaurin at the same rate Heineke was. So that just, leaves more target opportunity for guys like Dotson, guys like Curtis Samuel.
Yeah. So Jaydon Dotson's a wide receiver 35. I could see him up into the top 30. I mean, it's pretty nebulous in that range. So if you look at Dotson, you look at somebody else that's 2 spots above him in our wide receiver rankings, and you really prefer Dotson, feel free to go ahead and play him, because those guys are, if you're looking at 28 versus 30 in our rankings or 35 versus 32, that is almost never us taking a hard stance on number 32 over 35. You can consider those guys all basically tied, I would say.
Yeah, and make sure to check out the floor and ceiling projections too, which you can find on your My Team page when you're weighing these decisions again. It might make more sense to go someone with a higher floor. Some cases it might make sense to go a guy with a higher ceiling. To me, what's working against Dotson is I just don't think there's going to be big passing volume from Washington in this spot. But again, there's really not much separating Dotson and McLaurin at this point.
Yeah, and check out that team intel page, because you'll get specific recommendations for your team as opposed to just trusting the rankings, which, just take the overall projections as opposed to specifying for your scoring system, adding in the upside case. So yeah, team intel for the best recommendations. Anybody else from this game? Like, is it worth really considering Curtis Samuel here?
I don't think so. I mean, at this point of the season, I wouldn't want to trust it. He did average 8.3 targets in those 6 games with Carson Wentz. And Samuel also, he's averaging 2.5 carries per game this season. Like, they're consistently getting the ball in the running game too. So, he's in wide receiver 4 territory in our rankings. He's another guy. I do think the move to Carson Wentz helps his outlook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, don't overrate the volume from the Carson Wentz portion of the season. I would guess that they like the passing ability of the offense more with Carson Wentz in there than with Taylor Heineke, just based on how things have gone for the team this year and the sheer fact that they went back to Carson Wentz at all. That said, they didn't have Brian Robinson early, so I would expect more rushing now than what we had early in the season, which obviously hurts the target counts for everybody.
Yeah, and again, especially in this matchup, just a much tougher defense against the pass than the run.
And a spot where we don't expect Cleveland to jump out to a lead and force passing.
Right. Yep.
New Orleans at Philadelphia, Eagles by 6.5, over under 44. On the Saints side, we've got Alvin Kamara not practicing Wednesday for quad and personal reasons. So I don't know if he was thinking about how much his quad hurt or what. We'll see about his status through the week. Chris Olave was limited with the hamstring issue that kept him out last week. He's going to be tough for me to start right now, though. He's got 1 touchdown since week 5. He's been mostly just like mediocre to poor on the yardage front. And this has not been a matchup that has favored, long catch receivers.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. You want more of the short range guys against the Eagles. I think Olave is in the wide receiver 3 mix if he plays, and we don't have to worry about the hamstring, which we'll see how that trends over the next couple of days. Just 6 targets per game over his last 5, 42nd among receivers and expected fantasy points over that span, 35th in actual fantasy points. So I think no better than a wide receiver 3.
I think he and DJ Chark are a good comparison because you can look at either guy and say, yeah, either one could come out of this game with 4 targets or 7 or 8. I think there's a better chance that Chark hits a ceiling in this game than that Olave does. So I'm going to go ahead and chase that if I'm deciding between them in my lineup.
Yep, that's fair.
Taysom Hill, 6+ carries in 4 of the past 5 games, 9 last week. This should be a solid spot for more Taysom Hill use.
Yeah, I think he's definitely in play if you don't have like a locked-in starter at tight end.
Miles Sanders might end up not being in play for us now. It's too early to know. He did not practice Wednesday, which was a walkthrough with a knee issue. I haven't seen any explanation of the knee issue, though. I didn't see it pop up from that game where he carried plenty of times against Dallas and was in there until the end. And I checked around before the show as we were getting ready for it. I didn't see anybody saying, yeah, it's a minor issue, we expect him back, or anybody saying, yeah, I'm not sure about him this week. There's just, oh yeah, Miles Sanders was out Wednesday.
Yeah, I think that's his first time on the injury report all season. The Eagles have been holding some guys out on Wednesday specifically, but they'll usually list them on the injury report as rest, not with an actual body part. So we'll see. I mean, if Sanders sits, what do you do with the backfield? Does Boston Scott or Kenneth Gainwell become an option? I mean, it's a good spot for the running game. The Saints' run defense has not been good lately. They're 22nd in DVOA over the last 5 weeks.
I don't know what to do with it. I think both Boston Scott and Kenneth Gainwell would be in play. They haven't shown that they want to hand Kenneth Gainwell the ball very much. So I would bet on Boston Scott as the rushing leader if there's no Miles Sanders in this game.
I would lean that way too. I also think Gainwell would be the better target bet though. So I might lean in his direction if we're talking, a full PPR.
Yeah, and we'll certainly sort that out as we get later in the week if Miles Sanders is not in this game. So make sure you check the rankings, check your team intel page to see where those guys would land in that circumstance. We can expect Jalen Hurts to not play again. Apparently, we'll of course watch for confirmation on that, but it looks like Gardner Minshew should start again. He sits in QB1 territory in our rankings. Certainly a lot easier to trust him this week, Jared, after he put up big passing numbers for us against Dallas last week.
Yeah, and he definitely benefited from that game turning into a shootout. I don't think that's going to be the case here. Minshew did play well last week, though. PFF had him 9th in their passing grades. And I think, Philly having a 24.75 point implied total, 7th highest on the week, that's kind of what's working in his favor, just this offensive environment and weapons that Minshew has to work with. Philly did lean run last week, though. They were negative 7% pass rate over expected. I would expect the same this week. So I don't think you're going to ceiling game out of Minshew in this spot. But I think he's good enough and just this offense is good enough where he's going to be okay if you need to use him.
And the Saints defense used to be good, but it's not now. It's not a defense to alter anything for matchup wise.
Agreed.
Anything else to talk about from the Eagles side? I mean, there are obviously names, but I
Yeah.
don't think that there's a whole lot to say about AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert.
Yeah, I mean, I think Goddard is the one people might have questions about. He only got 3 targets last week. He ran her out on 89% of the pass play. So he was back to a full role. The concern this week is the matchup against New Orleans, who, that is a concern. The defense isn't good in general. The tight end matchup is a concern in New Orleans. They're first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. They're first in Football Outsiders tight end coverage rankings. Cade Otton is the only tight end to reach double-digit PPR points against New Orleans this season. So that's why Goddard sits lower in our rankings this week than he normally would. It's not because his role. I think his usage is fine. It's just the matchup.
Yeah, and I mean, he's certainly in a range where he could easily finish behind a couple of guys that are listed behind him. But I think the only guy ahead of him on the list that I'd have to look at our tight end rankings, but Mark Andrews is somebody that I am going to be pushing for moving down our rankings. We'll get to that game in a few minutes.
Okay.
Jets at Seattle up first, though. Jets by 1.5 here, over under 42.5. Jared, we got Mike White returning to this game, just like Jesus on Easter. Wondering if he can bring back the Garrett Wilson fantasy points, but this is not a great spot for wide receivers, as you alluded to earlier in the show.
Yeah, that's the concern. I mean, Seattle's third in adjusted points allowed to receivers. All their corners have just played well all season, really. I do think getting White back is obviously a big upgrade for the offense in general, for the wide receivers particularly. Garrett Wilson averaged 10 targets in Mike White's 3 games. He was 8th among all receivers in fantasy points in those games. Now, the Jets did throw it a ton. They kind of found themselves in spots where they had to elevate the passing volume. I don't think that's going to be the case here. But I definitely think getting White back, puts Wilson back in like comfortable wide receiver 2 range.
Yeah, in getting ready for the show, I was looking through the numbers and I wanted to move Garrett Wilson down. And then again, I looked behind him in the rankings. And it's like, well, who behind him do I actually like? And there are just not that many guys. So here's the case against Garrett Wilson and receivers facing Seattle. The Seahawks have not allowed a double-digit PPR score to a wide receiver since week 13. They're third toughest on wide receiver scoring for the season by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. No wide receiver has reached 75 yards since Mike Williams in week 7. They have since faced Devontae Adams and kept him to 74 yards in that game. Only 3 wideouts have reached 75 yards against Seattle all season. Jerry Jeudy back in week 1 is the only wide receiver to reach 90 yards against this defense. The biggest part of it has been Tariq Woolen, their rookie corner, playing excellent as their lead corner in his debut season. Again, Garrett Wilson sits 14th in our wide receiver rankings, and it's tough to get excited about guys behind him to move him down. I think really, when I thought about it more, wide receiver 14 is probably already down a bit from what he has been when the quarterback play has been decent for the Jets.
Yeah, for sure. Again, 8th in fantasy points in those 3 games, with Garrett Wilson 6th in expected fantasy points. And honestly, I mean, I know we haven't seen a ton of Garrett Wilson. I think he's good enough to win his fair share of this matchup.
I agree. And the other part of that is Seattle has actually been a positive scoring matchup for quarterbacks. So it's not that they're shutting down passing games all over the place. And I would like to think that the Jets could get Garrett Wilson away from Tariq Woolen if that does prove to be a problem in this game, enough to get him the ball, because they certainly don't have other pieces in the passing game that are really scaring defenses.
Yeah, I mean, the defense has funneled a lot of stuff to tight ends and even running backs in the passing game. I do think that puts Tyler Conklin in play as a low-end starter this week. Again, Seattle dead last in adjusted points allowed to tight ends. Football Outsiders has them 29th in tight end coverage rankings. And Tyler Conklin, 6 targets per game in those 3 Mike White starts, a 13.5% target share. So not great usage, but again, enough in this matchup to, I think, put him in play if you're really hard up for a tight end starter.
Yeah, I'm playing him over guys like Daniel Bellinger or Jelani Woods, who we talked about earlier, probably the Saints guys. But yeah, certainly don't elevate him too high. He's still a low floor, low ceiling guy. The one time he had a big game this year was the 2 touchdowns against the Patriots.
Yep, exactly.
On the Jets side, it's the matchups are interesting here. And I'm going to bring up the adjusted fantasy points allowed page that we've been talking to so we can take a look at it. Let me go over here so I can make sure I'm looking at what I'm talking about. So if you look at the Jets line, and this is the cool thing about this page, is you can see a team, you can just scroll across and see how they are against every position. So we'll look at the Jets because they have not been a great matchup for anybody, really. Negative, as you can see in red here for quarterbacks. Negative, not quite as bad for running backs. 24.3% down for wide receivers. So they're terrible on wide receiver scoring. We'll keep that in mind as we talk about the Seattle wide receivers in a minute. A positive matchup for tight ends. So we talked about Tyler Conklin on the Jets side. I think we'll talk about Noah Fant on the Seattle side in a minute. But I got a little bit ahead of myself and realized that we haven't talked about Bam Knight before we get to the matchup for the Seattle offense. It's a good spot for him. Let's go back to the adjusted fantasy points allowed page. And we know Seattle's been weak on running backs. They're way up here at the top, second best as a running back scoring matchup behind only Houston for the season.
Yeah, it's kind of scary to trust Bam Knight after 2 duds, but I just think getting Mike White back in there is going to make this offense functional. And in Mike White's 3 games, Knight averaged 15.3 carries, 3.3 targets. He was 12th among running backs in expected fantasy points per game, 18th in actual fantasy points per game. So, I'm not quite ready to rank Knight that highly, considering like an RB2, but I do think he's a pretty solid RB3. Again, as you said, this really good matchup against Seattle.
Yeah, I'm going to check and see exactly where he is in our rankings right now, because he's one of those guys that you can see the upside for, but you hesitate to rank him too high. So he's at 28th in our PPR rankings, not a high reception floor there, which hurts a little bit, but he's behind Latavius Murray, Rashad White. I could see playing him over either of those guys. Then comes AJ Dillon, Najee Harris. I think that's where it gets to be a little bit tricky and a little bit more personal decision time.
Yep, agreed. I probably would play Zonovan Knight over Latavius Murray. I would just rather, I think their roles are pretty similar. And I would just rather bet on this Jets offense and this Broncos offense.
Well, there you go. Bam Knight moved 1 spot up the rankings during this show. We'll see exactly where he lands by the weekend. But yeah, it's a good spot for him. And I think that the Jets coaches have at least some idea of what they're doing. I'm not saying it's the best coaching staff in the league, but it's not Jeff Saturday.
Yes, we can say that.
On the Seattle side, as I talked about, Jets have been a negative scoring matchup for basically everybody except tight ends. I would be able to overlook that some for Geno Smith if we weren't coming off a much rougher stretch for Geno Smith than we got used to earlier this season. So even if we get Tyler Lockett back, which surprisingly is a possibility for this week after he had finger surgery less than 2 weeks ago, even with Tyler Lockett back, I would rather not use Geno Smith this week against the Jets.
Yeah, the Geno Smith magic seems to be gone, I think. He's 20th in PFF passing grade over the last 5 weeks. The Seahawks have this 20-point implied total. Geno Smith, not a top 12 option for me at quarterback this week.
Yes. Tyler Lockett will be a tough decision if he is back. I'm not sure how high in the rankings we could place him. And really, I think it's going to depend a lot on what they say about how safe his hand is, if he's ready for full duty, if they're going to play him a little bit. We're going to have to watch reports on that one.
Yeah, Pete Carroll was optimistic on Wednesday, but the Seahawks listed the Seahawks listed Lockett as did not practice. I saw he still has stitches. He still had the stitches in his hand as of Wednesday. So I'm kind of guessing he doesn't play. And I think he'd be in wide receiver 3 range for me if he does suit up, just because there's obviously got to be added risk there with the hand injury. And this matchup isn't great, even if Lockett was at 100%.
Yeah, I kind of hope he doesn't play so we don't have that decision to make, but I could see playing him over Jacoby Myers, Michael Pittman, Chris Olave, Marquis Brown in that range if he's active.
Yeah, I think that's where he'd belong, right above those guys.
DK Metcalf, we're starting anyway. It's not a great matchup for him, but he should get plenty of volume. Noah Fant, I think, is the upside guy, and it helps that Will Dissly hit IR, so he's not in the mix this week. Yeah,
that helps. Like you said, the matchup is pretty good for Fant, at least, better than it is for the running backs and the wideouts. Fant, though, he didn't practice on Wednesday with the knee issue that had him sidelined all last week. And even last week after Dissly left pretty early in that game, Fant ran her out on just 55% of the dropbacks. He saw only 3 targets for a 7.5% target share. So If he was healthier, I'd be more interested. And we'll see how he progresses over these next couple of days. If he practices some and isn't on the final injury report, I'll feel better about him. But it just seems like he's banged up right now.
Yeah, we'll certainly be all over the injury reports the rest of the week. So make sure you check Shark Bites and updated rankings throughout the week for adjustments to those. By the way, before we move to the next game, Jeff McLean says that Jalen Hurts was throwing at the start of Eagles practice today. So we'll see what that means. If it's just somebody seeing how his shoulder feels or if he has a chance to play this week. I got to think that the Eagles don't play Jalen Hurts this week, though, because I really think that team can beat New Orleans without risking Jalen Hurts' shoulder.
Yeah, who do they play? They play the Giants week 18 because all they need is one more win. So yeah, I'm still betting against Hurts playing on Sunday.
Yeah, same here. San Francisco at Las Vegas, 49ers by 8, over under 43.5. We'll see where those numbers go following the Derek Carr stuff. Brock Purdy on the San Francisco side, 2 touchdown passes in all 4 of his appearances so far, except for the one early in the season where he showed up for a tiny bit of time. Passer rating over 110 in each of his 3 starts, 67% completions for the year. I think he's a high floor, low ceiling quarterback in this matchup.
Yeah, I mean, he's been doing it on efficiency, 8 yards per attempt over the last 4 games. He's averaging just 26.5 pass attempts per game. To put it in perspective, Purdy's 35th among quarterbacks in expected fantasy points over the last 4 weeks. He's 11th in actual fantasy points. He's the 3rd biggest overachiever at the position behind Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes. And he's playing well. It's a testament, though, to the offense. The weapons are still good, even without Deebo Samuel. So it's a bit scary because the volume has been so low, and I don't think it's going to increase in this matchup. But I'm also not betting against Purdy having another efficient game, against this Raiders defense. I think it's probably just going to lay over, with the way their season has ended up here. So Purdy doesn't quite reach quarterback 1 territory for me, but I do think he's a nice quarterback 2. The Niners have one of the highest implied totals on the week at 26 points. So it's definitely a good spot for Purdy.
Yeah, if you lost Jalen Hurts and somebody else has Gardner Minshew, I think Purdy can be a savior quarterback. I would worry more about his efficiency disappearing if we hadn't already seen guys like Nick Mullins and CJ Beathard also do those good efficiency things in the San Francisco offense.
Exactly.
Brandon Ayuk came back to life, actually got targets last week, so he becomes a better option, or at least a more comfy option for me this week than he was last week. And of course, another 2 touchdowns for George Kittle. I think we'd take another one of those games.
How about this? 14% of George Kittle's career touchdowns have come in these last 2 games.
All he needed was Brock Purdy. He's just been out there waiting for him.
14% of his touchdowns in 2.5% of his career games. I mean, you can't sit him after what he's done, obviously. And Ayuk is another one of these guys, like in wide receiver 3 range, where it's tough to project big volume. But I do expect him to be efficient because he's a good player and he's facing a bad defense.
Mm-hmm. On the Raiders side, Josh Jacobs falls down our rankings for the matchup. I still think he's tough to not use because I expect him to get the ball plenty in this one. And I think that he'll be needed in the passing game. We only got 8 total targets for him over the past 4 games, but still 11th among running backs in total targets for the season. And, barring some report that they plan to alter his usage, I don't have any reason right now to expect a change in usage. Like the Derek Carr stuff is because if he goes down with a serious knee injury, then they're locked into his contract next year. But if Josh Jacobs goes down this week with a serious knee injury, he's still a free agent in the spring.
Yeah, and we still have Jacobs projected right now for a full workload. That still lands him in like mid to low end RB2 range, just because it was a bad spot for him even before the Carr news. This Niners run defense is just awesome. They're first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. The passing game volume is a concern for me for Jacobs. That it's down, as you said, over the past few weeks. And then you have the Raiders with a 16-point implied total, so it's tough to feel good about Jacobs' touchdown chances. So to me, it's only the volume that is keeping him in play as an RB2 play this week.
I agree with that. I would still play him over Pacheco, Kenneth Walker, Nick Chubb, and probably DeAndre Swift in our PPR rankings.
Not I.
We'll see if anybody else supports that on staff. We do this throughout the week, by the way, either on or off the show. So make sure that you check your team intel page through the weekend for the final resting spot for these guys. Because, we get the projections out to begin the week, but there's always stuff that you learn throughout the week, including the injury stuff, that can change things, even just how you think about a player. And of course, the biggest change for the Raiders this week, Jarrett Stidham in for Derek Carr. And I wish that the team would just like come out and tell the truth and be like, listen, we don't want to get locked into Derek Carr's contract beyond the season. So we're going to sit him for the final 2 weeks. Cause that's obviously the motivation here. There's no other reason to go to Jarrett Stidham, who stunk so bad that the Patriots are like, we'd rather have you leave town and we'll keep 36-year-old Brian Hoyer as our backup quarterback.
Yeah, I think Stidham is very likely bad. We were talking. I don't think he's Trace McSorley level bad.
Might be.
I think he can keep Davante Adams afloat. Again, Adams is a guy I'd lean towards sticking with in fantasy lineups unless we get a report, on Sunday that his snaps are going to be scaled back in this game.
I would lean away. And again, I don't expect anybody else to have their snaps scaled down because they're locked into Davante Adams next year either way. So, I mean, it wouldn't make sense to me to just sit, a few choice players. Not only is there no upside to, beyond, I guess, avoiding catastrophic injury, but you're also telling the rest of your team, you're not that important. It's only these guys that matter. So I'm going to rest them for these final 2 games that you still have to play your hardest during. I am leaning the other way. I would rather not play Davante Adams if I have worthwhile options. This to me does look pretty close to the DeAndre Hopkins with Trace McSorley situation last week. And I think the key difference is Davante Adams is the one guy that the 49ers know they need to stop. Like they can just, if they try to stop him from getting open, then there's nothing to worry about in the Raiders pass offense. And a big part of Davante Adams's game is catching tight quarter passes. Like both Aaron Rodgers and Derek Carr will give him chances even when the coverage is right there. That's not going to be a Jarrett Stidham play. So I hate the downside risk. I would rather play Drake London, Brandon Ayuk, and maybe DJ Chark over Davante Adams this week.
I mean, Adams is good at contested catches. He's good at a lot of stuff. I mean, to me, he's still one of the 5 best receivers in the NFL. I still think he's a pretty good value bet. The Niners, by the way, they're 23rd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. I mean, we just saw Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson have good games against this defense. Again, I'm just betting on Adams' volume and talent and sticking with him. It's definitely a downgrade. He's in like low end wide receiver 2 territory in our rankings, but I wouldn't go as far as someone like starting Drake London over Adams this week.
2 catches for 15 yards last week, 4 catches for 28 yards the week before, 3 for 71 the game before that. I'd be more willing to stick with Davante Adams if we hadn't already seen examples of him letting us down in the situation with a better quarterback. So for me, I don't care how the 49ers are against wide receivers for the season. I think that they're a good defense overall, and this will be the first time they face Jarrett Stidham.
Yeah, and let's not throw out Adams' first 12 games or whatever, where he was a monster.
Even in that stretch, he had some down games. So, obviously anybody can look back and see the wide swings in his production. But for me, because I already know that it's possible for him to disappoint, and now he's playing with an awful quarterback, I would like to bet elsewhere for floor. This is the spot where I'm going to go ahead and bet on floor because I'm not scared of missing out on a big ceiling for Davante Adams.
Fair enough.
Rams at the Chargers, unless you want to talk about any other Raiders pass catchers, but I figure they're out.
They're out, yeah. That includes Darren Waller, who was a shaky play even if it was Carr under center. His volume hasn't been good in his 2 games back. His route rates haven't been good in his last 2 games back. So for me, with Stidham under center, Waller's definitely a bench for me.
Rams at Chargers by 6.5, over under 41. I guess the odds makers didn't watch the Rams bust out on offense last week because this is just disrespectful. Really though, Jared, I'm treating last week mostly like it never happened for the Rams. The big production for Cam Akers and for Tyler Higbee came absolutely out of nowhere in that game.
Yeah. Now I'm a bit disappointed we weren't a little higher on Akers last week, and not that we could have called that game. But we did, I think, mention on the show last week that he did set a season high in snap rate in week 15 and basically matched that last week, playing 75% of the Rams offensive snaps. Also ran a pass route on 60% of the pass play. So he pretty much got feature back usage last week. Now, the positive game script and a Broncos defense that quit led to the big game. I don't think he's going to get either of those things in this game against the Chargers. But I any running back playing 75% of his team's offensive snaps and getting most of the passing game work, I think is worth starting at some level.
The Broncos were favored in that game. Like the way that game went came completely out of nowhere. So yeah, I would have liked, like, in hindsight, I think it's easy to say, man, Cam Akers probably should have been a little higher. Tyler Higbee probably should have been a little higher. But the way that game went was completely not predictable. So, we'll look at the things that did go right for the Rams in that one. And I do think that there are corrections to be made on both Akers and Higbee. I would say Akers, especially because of the things that you just mentioned, he has been dominating backfield work lately. And this week they get a Chargers team that should be a lot better than they are, but hasn't really been playing like it. Like, they barely got by the Colts on Monday night against a team that was trying really hard to lose that game to him. Akers has scored in 3 of the past 4. He's been over 5 yards per carry in 2 straight. We talked about Zach Moss going over 5 yards per carry against the Chargers on Monday night. The Chargers are allowing 5.5 yards per carry to running backs for the season. So there's definitely some upside to Cam Akers in this game. For sure. Yeah.
I do think the Chargers defense has been better lately. It's really been the offense that's been letting them down. They're still 16th in Football Outsiders run defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks. They're actually 6th against the pass. So that's kind of where they've improved more. I do still think it's a good matchup for Akers. The downside and why he's not higher in our rankings is just I still don't trust this Rams offense. The bookmakers don't either. The Rams having a 17.25 point implied total. So I still think the ceiling is capped on Akers, which sounds crazy after what he did last week. I think he's more of a floor play guy who's going to get 15 to 20 touches.
Yeah, and he, like I said, he did still score multiple times over the previous few games as well. So he certainly has a chance to score, but don't expect anything close to the ceiling of last week. Tyler Higbee, I think, is also in play. The Chargers have been a negative matchup for tight ends on the season, but Derwin James looked like he's going to miss this game with a concussion. The Titans tight ends caught 6 passes among 9 targets with no Derwin James in week 15 in that matchup. Week 14 also had no Derwin James. The Dolphins didn't do anything with tight ends because they forgot that Mike Gesicki exists this year, and also their quarterback played like butt in that game.
Yeah, I mean, Higbee's 12th in our PPR rankings at tight end. So he's definitely an option. He saw 11 targets last week, but he had 8 total targets the 2 previous games in Baker Mayfield's first start. So don't go overboard with Higbee. I do think he's probably the best bet to lead the Rams in targets this week, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's another 5-6 target game for him.
Yeah, best bet shouldn't be mistaken for definite leader in targets, because we could also get a game where Van Jefferson leads the team in targets. We already had the Ben Skoranek blow up game when Baker Mayfield was fresh off the plane. So this is not an offense to actually predict things. It's to more take educated guesses.
For sure.
On the Chargers side, wide receivers are fine. They've been fine when they're healthy. Justin Herbert has not been fine. Tied for 14th in fantasy points per game for the season. Under 15 fantasy points in 2 straight games. 1 touchdown pass or fewer in 4 straight, and 6 of his past 8. There should certainly be some rebound on those touchdowns because he's been better than that overall. But we can't ignore a stretch that long of disappointing touchdowns.
Yeah, he has a 1.7% passing touchdown rate over his last 4 games, 5.1% over his first 45. I mean, he's averaging 313 passing yards over his last 4 games. He just hasn't thrown touchdowns. He's just too good, and his weapons are too good for me to bet on that continuing. I'd feel fine sticking with Herbert as my starter this week.
The Rams are the 6th toughest matchup for QB scoring by our adjusted fantasy points allowed, but they're just 20th in pass defense DVOA. So I think somewhere in there you get kind of a neutral matchup for Herbert in this one. I would go ahead and play him over Gardner Minshew. Toss up for me, though, between Justin Herbert and Kirk Cousins. Cousins looks like the higher floor option between them for me. And then I'm playing Jared Goff, Dak Prescott, and Trevor Lawrence over Justin Herbert this week.
Yeah, Dak and Lawrence for sure. Goff and Herbert, I can go either way on. I mean, you sit down and do projections. I think Herbert's going to come out higher. But again, I mean, I'd like to see how they come out. I mean, I do think Goff's a better touchdown bet this week. So I'd be fine playing him over Herbert.
Anything else from that game?
Keep an eye on Austin Eckler, who it looked like he hurt his knee late in last week's game and then was limited in Wednesday's practice. The Chargers, I mean, they clinched a playoff spot last week. They're either going to be the 5, 6, or 7 seed. So I don't know how much they care about this game. So I think there's a chance Eckler is held out. I would go pick up Josh Kelly if he's still available. I think he'd be an okay fantasy play if Eckler ends up sitting.
And watch those Sunday reports, because that's where we can get stuff like, hey, expect Austin Eckler to have his role limited today.
Yep, for sure.
Minnesota at Green Bay, Packers by 3 over under 48. Vikings are pretty straightforward. We've got Adam Thielen down in our wide receiver 4 territory in our rankings. We had KJ Osborne turn back into a pumpkin last week, and TJ Hawkinson is a very easy volume bet at a position with little that we can count on.
For sure, yeah. I think Thielen's tougher to like just when we've had these games recently where Hawkinson pops up for a big one, Osborne pops up for a big one. Like, in the past, Thielen's kind of been like the clear number 2 guy behind Jefferson, but that's not the case anymore.
Kirk Cousins has averaged 47.7 pass attempts over his past 3 games, 299 plus in the yardage category. In each of those, 9 touchdowns. He's averaging 39.5 pass attempts per game for the season. Also threw for 277 and 2 against the Packers back in week 1, despite Minnesota winning that game pretty easily. So to me, Kirk Cousins looks like a fairly high floor option this week, certainly a higher floor than Justin Herbert versus what we've seen lately.
Yeah, 277 and 2 against Green Bay back in week 1. Also had 341 and 3 against them in his one game against the Packers back in 2021. He missed the other one. Both those games came at home, so he was indoors. He'll be outside in Lambeau at this one. I guess my concerns for Cousins. Green Bay's first in Football Outsiders pass defense DVOA over the past 5 weeks. They've remained bad against the run, so we could see a bit more of a run lean here from Minnesota, even though there has been a pass leaning offense for most of the season. Vikings also just 22.25 implied points, 13th on the week. Cousins is okay. I don't think it's going to be another ceiling gain for him here, but I do think his floor is fine. There should be some points scored in this game.
I'm okay with modest confidence for Kirk Cousins this week, and I don't like. The thing about those past 3 games is they had lots and lots of points scored in them. I don't think the Packers are capable of scoring lots and lots of points. So if there are a good number of points scored, I think the Vikings are going to be in the lead, and maybe that works against the passing volume. I don't think that there's shootout potential for this game. The weather, it's going to be colder than if they're playing inside for sure, but the current forecast is 34 degrees. So it doesn't seem like it's going to be the kind of weather that really alters what we should expect.
Yep, that's fair.
Vikings have lost 3 straight against the spread, by the way, 5-2 against the spread in 7 games before that. So we'll kind of see which Vikings team shows up. Maybe that determines somewhat how the game flow goes. The Packers on the other side have covered the spread in 3 straight, 1-7 against the spread in the previous 8 games, favored in 6 of those 8 games. They're favored in this game. I'm a little bit surprised by that, but they are at home, so I guess it makes sense. The injuries will be worth watching. We'll get to Aaron Jones in a minute, but Aaron Rodgers did not practice Wednesday, and we've seen this before. He's dealing with the right thumb thing. He's also listed with a knee issue. We've seen him miss Wednesday before. I don't think he's in danger of missing the game, but this is the first practice that he's missed since week 13. So maybe that means between these 2 issues, he's more dinged up right now than he has been over the past few weeks when he really hasn't been that good.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on the knee thing over the next couple of days. On paper, it's another good spot for Aaron Rodgers. The Vikings past he's been bad all season. Actually, 4 of the last 5 quarterbacks to face Minnesota have finished top 10 on the week in fantasy points. Packers also have the 4th highest implied total on the week, but Rodgers has had good spots the past couple of weeks too, and just hasn't delivered. And the big thing working against him this week for me is Christian Watson might miss this game. Did not practice on Wednesday after missing the second half of last week's game against Miami. So if Watson's out, that takes a lot of the upside out of this passing game.
And Aaron Rodgers takes the rest of the upside out. Hasn't hit 240 yards in a game since week 9 at Detroit. So there's just no ceiling here. Aaron Jones is the other injury that matters. Limited Wednesday. He hurt an ankle on the first carry of the second half against Miami. He said played through it in that game, had limited work overall for the game. He's also playing through a knee issue, and he's been listed with multiple injuries on the injury report ever since week 10. The last full practice for Aaron Jones was in week 9. So it's fair to guess that he's pretty banged up at this point. And Jared, Dr. Jesse, who we've had on the show before, I saw a video from him this morning about Aaron Jones dealing with a shin injury, which he said in his video is probably a shin splint or stress fracture. I think he said a shin splint kind of injury. That injury came in week 11, I believe, week 10. So week 11 on is when he's been playing through that. Before that injury, he was averaging 13.1 carries per game, 5.6 yards per carry, a 118 elusive rating over that span. That was fourth best among all running backs with 30 plus carries. Since the injury, 4 yards per carry, down from 5.6, 11.2 carries per game, a 37.8 elusive rating. So now he's near the bottom of qualifying running backs over the recent stretch. Clearly, he has not been performing at that top level for him. I certainly think that that's a reason to worry about him this week and a reason that he sits relatively low in our rankings.
Yeah, that's a similar injury to the one Antonio Gibson played through last year. And, his efficiency stuff was way down, at least from what it was during his rookie season. So you said Aaron Jones suffered that injury on his first carry in the second half. Even in the first half, A.J. Dillon had out-carried Aaron Jones 3-2 and out-targeted him 2-1. So, Dillon, even for the past couple of weeks, has been mixing in, quite a bit where this is like a 50-50 backfield split at this point. And I wouldn't be surprised if it leans even more towards Dillon in this game if Jones is banged up. And I do expect Jones to play because this is a must-win game for the Packers. But yeah, he's definitely a risky fantasy starter this week. And I wouldn't be opposed to anyone starting A.J. Dillon over Aaron Jones if you have that decision.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe we should flip those guys in the rankings or at least stick both of them together right behind Cam Akers. Najee Harris, who we'll get to in a minute, is not somebody that I'm reaching for. So maybe I'm starting either Packer over that guy.
Yeah, that's fair.
Anything else from this game? I mean, you talked about Christian Watson a little bit. I think we kind of have to wait and see.
Wait and see on him. And I do think it matters for Allen Lazard. Lazard played 7 games this season before Christian Watson emerged as a full-time player in this Packers offense. In those 7 games, Lazard averaged 7.3 targets per game on a 20% target share. He was 20th in expected fantasy points among receivers in those 7 games, 17th in actual fantasy points. And the Vikings are dead last in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. So it's a good spot for Allen Lazard. I think he's a nice wide receiver 3 if Christian Watson sits this week.
Yeah, he's never somebody that I look at in a given week and think, ooh, it's Allen Lazard week. I'm always like, oh, do I have to use Allen Lazard? But I can certainly see the upside path, and especially if Christian Watson's out.
Yep.
Sunday night, Pittsburgh at Baltimore, one to go to bed early. Ravens for 2.5, over under 35.5.
They flexed this.
What? What?
They flexed this game to Sunday night. Like we want to watch it.
I thought you were saying why go to bed. I was worried there for a second. Yeah, Lamar Jackson's still not practicing, so he's probably not involved in this game. And that keeps me from betting on anything Baltimore side. Mark Andrews is the big name worth talking about at this point. I would move him down the rankings from where he currently is. 3 catches, 36.5 yards per game with Tyler Huntley this year. And we still have, last year's big games with Huntley to talk about, to look at, to consider. But over that stretch, Tyler Huntley averaged 35.4 pass attempts per game in 5 games where he got starter level duty this year. 22.8 per game in 4. So that's the biggest thing. And then you throw in inefficiency in what Andrews is getting. He's just not a guy to bet on right now.
Yeah, and I'm not factoring in last year's Andrews Huntley stuff at all at this point. It's just Andrews has a 48% catch rate with Tyler Huntley, which I just can't imagine that staying that low. He's still averaging 6.3 targets in these Huntley games, which isn't a great number, but it's still, a pretty solid mark as far as tight ends go. So, to me, Andrews sits as high as he does in the rankings just because I don't feel great about anyone else behind him. Not that I feel great about Andrews.
I would play everybody down through Pat Freiermuth in our current rankings over him, which would put Mark Andrews 10th at PPR.
Yeah, and I mean, those guys are separated by 0.6 of a PPR point. So they're all super close.
All right. So check back and see if I succeeded in getting Jared to push Mark Andrews down the rankings. Cause there probably are some that are making decisions on guys within that range. Certainly not a matter of being excited. I agree. But I think that there's more upside to Pat Freiermuth in the same matchup than there is Mark Andrews. And I'm not scared of missing out on a ceiling with Andrews.
Yep.
On the Baltimore side, still split backfield bit J.K. Dobbins last week. We knew that was the case. We know that that's the risk with him. Continues to be the risk here, and this is not a boom spot for either Ravens running back.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, Pittsburgh's second in Football Outsiders run defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks. But Dobbins went for 120 yards and a score against them back in week 14 on 15 carries. And he's remained super efficient. So he's in RB3 range in our PPR rankings. He obviously climbs in non-PPR and half PPR. But again, you're definitely counting on the efficiency continuing because he's probably not going to get more than 15 or so carries, and he's basically a zero in the passing game.
He's basically exactly the same as Deontay Foreman.
Yeah, I think he's better. But that's about it. I think the roles are pretty similar.
I think he's a more talented player, but he's also had knee surgery within the past 2 months. So, I mean, that probably balances it out on that front a little bit.
Maybe, again, the efficiency has been off the charts since he came back.
Yeah, but for other guys, off the charts efficiency is something that we correct downward, and then we doubt them going forward.
Yeah, Dobbins also averaged 6 yards per carry as a rookie. And again, if you look at our projections, we're not projecting him for the 5.7 yards per carry he's averaged so far this season. That's why if we were, he'd be in RB2 range.
Najee Harris on the other side, a much better bet, 4 touches. Bad matchup for him, though, too. I mean, I know Tyler Algier put up yards on the Ravens last week. Maybe Najee Harris puts up yards this week, but he didn't have a great matchup with them last time and hasn't done a whole lot for most of the season. So he's one of those, he'll get enough volume to still be in the picture plays, but not somebody I'm excited about this week.
For sure, yeah. His usage and I think his play has been better lately. You look at the last 4 games, 17.3 carries per game, 3.3 targets per game. He's 16th among running backs in expected fantasy points over that span. But he sits much lower than that in our rankings this week because of the matchup. Baltimore still the best run defense in DVOA over the last 5 weeks. Najee, 12 carries for 33 yards and a touchdown against them back in week 14, caught 2 of 3 targets for 17 yards. I mean, that type of game is definitely within range this week. And if he doesn't score, he's going to hurt you.
Yeah, and we had the big target game last week and Kenny Pickett's return to the lineup, but we haven't had many of those otherwise. He had 0 targets the game before. He had 3 1-1 the 3 games before that. So we should not bet on big target volume for Najee Harris, even if we can still consider that it's possible.
Yep, that's fair.
Elsewhere on the Pittsburgh side, Deontay Johnson, Pat Freiermuth, the names. I think Pat Freiermuth coming back to life last week is definitely worth noting. 7 catches, 66 yards on 8 targets. The Ravens matchup has been neutral for both tight end and wide receiver scoring on the year. So I think it's a solid spot for Pat Freiermuth, especially if we don't expect Najee Harris to find much success on the ground.
Yeah, an 88% route rate for Freiermuth last week. And even the week before that, he was back up to 70%. So we have 2 straight games now of him playing enough to make him a pretty comfortable fantasy starter, even if I don't think the upside is big just because this game's going to suck.
Deontay Johnson should be comfier than he is, but the return of Kenny Pickett last week brought an 18% target share, and target share has really been the only reason to play Deontay Johnson.
I'm hoping he goes all 17 games without scoring a touchdown. That'd be fun.
He also is dealing with an injury. I mean, he played through it last week, but it's just one more, like, if you don't want to play Deontay Johnson, there's one more reason not to.
Yep, for sure. He's a classic guy like you weigh against like DJ Chark, where I think Johnson's safer, but I think Chark easily beats him on upside.
Especially, I think Chark is easier to like now that we did get that 18% target share for Deontay Johnson last week. And the target share has been an issue for Johnson with Pickett earlier this season as well, where he's gotten a lot more from Trubisky.
Yep, for sure.
Anything else from that game?
No.
Monday night to close it out. Should be a quick one. Buffalo at Cincinnati. Bills by 1.5, over under 49.5. And I'm playing absolutely everybody. The current forecast even is like, we're not going to mess with this game. 58 degrees, like no rain currently. We'll see if that changes by the weekend. But I mean, this looks like a spot where we should get lots of points. I'm even a little surprised that this over under is lower than Detroit's.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think there's some respect for the Bills defense, I guess, for the Bengals to just have a 24-point implied total, but I'm definitely not running away from any of the usuals here. I think on the Bills side, I think Dawson Knox is the fringy guy that I'd lean towards playing at this point. He's averaging 6.7 targets on a 21.5% target share over his last 3 games. And his route rates have been strong, even dating farther back than that. So Knox has kind of reemerged as a pretty key piece of this Bills passing game.
Yeah, so he's in the range where if I'm deciding between him and Mark Andrews, maybe I lean toward Mark Andrews' targets. But even so, I wouldn't argue with anybody that wanted to take a shot on Knox's upside there.
Yeah. Bengals have been pretty tough against tight ends, but still not a matchup I'm really afraid of for Knox.
Bills have topped 30 points in 2 straight. So we had some touchy spots there, mostly when Josh Allen was dealing with his elbow injury, but not really worried about that aspect now. They're 4th in scoring for the season. The Bengals have been up and down in how many points they put up, but 6th in scoring for the season. So, we got 2 top 6 offenses. We should have plenty of points. It should be a fun spot for fantasy.
Yeah, and the Bengals side, the one thing I'm looking for is I don't know if Tyler Boyd re-injured his finger last week, but his routes were way down, and that's what led to Trenton Irwin having that 2 touchdown game. He seemed to play over Boyd in some spots last week. So we'll get the Bengals first injury report later today. But Boyd is someone, even in this spot, I'd probably lean against using.
Yeah, we'll certainly watch for that to see if there is an injury explanation. And you can certainly keep an eye on team intel and the rankings the rest of the week, as well as the Shark Bite section to see where we adjust these guys and what comes out on the news front. That's going to do it, though, for this Week 17 preview edition of the podcast. You can head over to draftsharks.com now to see our full rankings and to see that team intel page I've been referring to, see exactly who we'd recommend for your specific starting lineup for championship week. Jared and I will be back tomorrow for our usual DFS shows. We're going to hit FanDuel. We're going to hit DraftKings. We're going to hit drafting on both Underdog and Sleeper. Jared, I need a rebound week on Sleeper because Geno Smith didn't go so well for me in those lineups last week.
Oh, Matt, I had a sweat on Underdog last week. We'll talk about it tomorrow.
Oh, all right. Nice teaser for that Friday show. For Jared Small and the rest of the Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schaff saying thanks so much for swimming with us.